So hello to everybody, and for this next new economy shortcut for our forum on the French elections and some topics that we are very much interested in around these elections, and some very very important issues around who will run this election, who will win this election, and what is the impact of a vote that seems, for maybe in Germany, still some strange in the way that there are a lot of parties and a lot of parties around, and a lot of parties who are really fundamentally questioning the political system, which is maybe something that is not as advanced in Germany, even if that's comparable. Then the elections, just to start, will take place, the first round of the presidential elections, on 10th of April, which is in a week, or a little more than a week. And then afterwards there will be a second round with the two first candidates coming out of the first round. And for the moment, it seems there is an advance of President Emmanuel Macron, but shrinking in the last few days again, after somewhat positive days for him after the outbreak of the war in from Russia and Ukraine. And then now Marine Le Pen from the Rassemblement National, the far right, is catching up, and it seems as if it's not as clear as it may have seemed some 10 days ago that the election is done. We have an excellent panel to discuss and to bring the debate a little nearer to our public and to our topics. Starting with Cornelia Woll, who has just started some 2 weeks ago as president of the Hertie School in Berlin, formerly at Sciences Po in Paris for many years, and so an excellent knowledge of the French scene and politician and political developments. There is Anne-Laure Delatte, who's professor at the CNRS, the research at the French Institute for Scientific Research, and a fellow of OFCE Sciences Po. Shahin Vallée, who's just joined us, who's head of the DGAP Geoeconomics program in Berlin, and formerly, among many other things, advisor also in a former time to Emmanuel Macron at the ministry when he was French Minister of Economy and Finance. And finally, Moritz Schularick, professor of economics at Sciences Po currently, and for most known at the University of Bonn, and so someone who is also now inside the French development. We just touched upon it. I think most of you now, don't know for Moritz, but the others are in Paris, and I heard in the radio that there has been snow in the morning in Paris, which is quite unusual for the 1st of April. So we are having the better weather for the time, which is also quite unusual if we see it like this. Please, I would start to ask Cornelia Woll to give us a first overview of the situation in France and the first interpretation, and then we will get to the other panelists and have a discussion on some of the most important issues of this election. Please.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for the kind invitation, and thank you also for the introduction. Since I have the floor, I'll just correct my colleague's affiliation. Anne-Laure Delatte did this, and I caught it because she's unfortunately not a member of OFCE, which means she would have been my colleague, but of Paris Dauphine. So I just wanted to throw this in. But let me start you off with a general overview of where we're currently at in the elections. It's true that the press tends to say it will be a boring election because the advance of Emmanuel Macron is too far for this to really have any turnarounds. That is, of course, always wrong because elections are only over when the election is over. There is always room for some surprises. And the main nervousness that is now in Emmanuel Macron's campaign is really the participation rate, because if abstention is sufficiently high, it might be that the outlook for him is a little bit less rosy than what it currently looks. But if abstention is not a major issue, it's true that Emmanuel Macron has intentions of voting in his favor in the first round of about 28%. It always moves. And the person coming second, Marine Le Pen, is close to 20, possibly 19%. And then the third person, and that is a bit of the surprise of the recent weeks, is Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And the two candidates who have gone down by quite a bit are the center-right candidate Valérie Pécresse and the far-right candidate Éric Zemmour, who are hovering around 11%. So what does all of this mean? It is definitely the result of what one could call the Ukraine shock or the Russia shock to the election that has given a considerable boost to Emmanuel Macron, because he seemed, first of all, he had, of course, as the incumbent, the statesmanship role of actually being in a position to negotiate, intervene, have diplomatic initiatives, and be in place, and also appear statesmanship-ish. I don't know what the English word is. Which definitely was an advantage. He also was the candidate that had not had to take such a credibility shock as, for example, Éric Zemmour. Éric Zemmour, who has run a campaign on being very provocative on all sorts of issues, has been cited in the press with quotes such as "France needs a Putin of himself," very closely to the February invasion. He stated that he didn't believe that Russia would ever invade Ukraine. So he just, his credibility really took a hit. And even though he was the surprise candidate and certainly the one that got most media attention, his candidacy, I think, was ruined by the recent events, which also explains why, in turn, Marine Le Pen had quite an uprising a bit later than the Russian invasion. I would say probably with a 2-week delay, we see that voters who previously might have announced their intention to vote for Éric Zemmour now rally behind Marine Le Pen. It is still going to be a somewhat close race. If the most likely outcome will be Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen in the second round, it looks like it will be somewhere between 54% for Emmanuel Macron and 46% for Marine Le Pen, which is a lot. That means that the conservative votes and the far-right votes that would combined go to her are substantial, and that's something we should discuss. Where does this development come from? I will leave the meat of it to my colleagues. I will just say that what may seem surprising about French politics, and that is this divide between candidates such as Emmanuel Macron and, as you say, a host of populist candidates, is, in my opinion, already part of the answer why we have it. I think part of the importance of the populist parties comes from the Macron candidacy itself, because what we see in France is the shift of a political competition away from a left-right competition, which was the traditional axis of political competition, and towards what political scientists call the second axis of political competition, which sometimes is called a cultural axis or a liberal authoritarian axis or a cosmopolitan nationalist axis. And that axis is really quite structuring for French politics now. We saw that Emmanuel Macron created his movement En Marche in order to be neither left nor right. There's endless discussions of how left or right he is, but he says he wants to do away with this divide, but he certainly stands for this other axis, the cosmopolitan, pro-European, multilateral culturally relatively open axis. And that means that in order to compete with him, those who provide an alternative will somehow be where the extreme right has been, in a more authoritarian, more France-focused, national items-focused, and sometimes also conservative, culturally speaking, axis. And that is why we see several candidates there. It's the case for Marine Le Pen, it's the case for Eric Zemmour, and that has been a structuring element that we don't see to the same extent in the countries in which the left-right axis is still the main axis of political competition. Some other countries, some countries other than France, have also shifted in comparable ways, but I think that is part of the explanation that we need to look at. And in order to not take so much time, I will stop here, and I'm interested in hearing what my colleagues will have to say. Thank you.
Many thanks for that overview, starting the discussion. Let's turn over to Anne-Laure from Université Paris-Dauphine, excusez-moi pour le départ. You wanted to add something on the question on if there is a clear win for Macron or not.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, no, you were perfectly right. I'm a CNRS researcher, but not affiliated to OFCE in fact. So I'm a CNRS at Dauphine and a CEPR member, but not affiliated at OFCE. That's it. So thank you very much for the invitation. That's quite an exciting moment, but also quite scary, not only because it's snowing in April, but because, as Cornelia just said, it's kind of quite a close race election that seems to be boring, but that might not be boring in the end. So look. So can you see my screen? Yes. Okay. Yes. So this is the second round poll based on more than 1,200 surveys in time. If Macron runs against Le Pen for the second round, and look, as Cornelia just said, the gap between Macron and Le Pen is around. You said something like 54 and 46, but look at the margin of error. Now it's quite interesting. And what is the most interesting is that last time Macron ran against Le Pen was 5 years ago in 2017, and she got 1/3 of the vote. So I think that the most important question is what drove this quite important rise of Le Pen over the last 5 years. So to answer, I mostly rely on an excellent work by Fondation Jean Jaurès that was actually done a year ago. So some of the data would deserve to be updated, but I think that we can have very nice insights from this. So 3 factors will determine the final results in case of Le Pen and Macron. The first one is the first one would be a massive vote shift from traditional right wing, held by Pécresse today, les Républicains, to Le Pen. This is the first factor. The second one, which are not cumulative, would be a significant non-participation among supporters of defeated candidates from the first round. And the third factor would be a significant voting against Macron outside Le Pen camp, meaning which would drive a massive non-participation too. So the first one, likelihood of vote transfer from traditional right-wing party to from Pécresse to Le Pen, how likely is it? They have a very nice graph that I will explain you now. Okay. So the risk of convergence of far left and far right is quite limited because they have a very different platform. So the massive, the realistic reservoir of votes for Le Pen is within the traditional right-wing voters for 2 reasons. the first thing is Emmanuel Macron has actually attracted a part of the far right, the right-wing voters, traditional right-wing voters. So those who remain for in the traditional right-wing voters are less, they have less centrist political views than before. And there is a convergence in the platform of Les Républicains, so Valérie Pécresse, traditional right-wing party, and le Rassemblement National, which is Marine Le Pen. And as you can see here, so this is the distance between both parties on cultural and economic views in the party platform. And as you can see, the distance is at the minimum this year on cultural and economic views. The interesting thing is if you look at the political platform now, what is the impact on the voters from platform to effective voting? And they have a second set of data, which I find super interesting. This is the distance between LR and RN voters on cultural and economic views. And here you can see something which is quite interesting. On the left-hand side, you have the cultural views. So
Valerie, we can't hear you. I can't hear you. I don't know for the others, but
no, I think we lost Anne-Laure. Maybe it's the snow.
no.
Can you try again?
Now you're back.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm
okay.
back?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. That's the snow. So what I wanted to emphasize here is that there is still a divergence on the economic views among voters of those two parties, but on the cultural views, like illegal immigration, fight against terrorism, the distance is actually is actually reducing. So that's for the first. Factor. The second factor would be a non-participation among voters of defeated candidates, like the voters of Mélenchon, Jadot, Pécresse, etc. So two determinants here: how scary Marine Le Pen is, and how unpopular Emmanuel Macron is among voters of defeated candidates. On the first dimension, this graph shows the French electorate opinion about Marine Le Pen, depending on whether they have green is good opinion, red is bad opinion, negative opinion, and the brown one is very negative opinion. And the very negative opinion is a good proxy for stigma, the stigma on Marine Le Pen. And actually, if red and green are quite stable, you can see that the brown one is interestingly downward sloping. It means that the stigma around her candidacy has significantly dropped since 2017. Why? Because her strategy to become like a standard candidate looks quite successful. And they have built a demonizing index. I tried to translate. Let me know if it's clear. Demonizing index, meaning how scary she is. And so it's on 6 dimensions that I can describe in the Q&A session, but it's quite in the 6 dimensions are quite exhaustive. And look at the index. It has dropped by 9 points since the last election. She's in a more favorable position than 2017, which could explain why we have this close race election now. Now, on this, the second dimension of this dimension, how unpopular Emmanuel Macron is among voters of eliminated candidates. On this graph, you have negative opinions against Le Pen on the left-hand side and Macron on the right-hand side along the political spectrum. Okay, red is negative and blue is positive. So what you want to take away from this graph is the fact that if you look, so left-wing voters are more have more negative opinions on Le Pen than on Macron, right? But this is the contrary for the right-wing voters, which brings us back to the first argument. There is quite a proximity between the traditional right wing and Le Pen. But this is another way, a more radical way to express it. So, so this is how Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron receives quite a lot of negative opinions among the voters. So the conclusion is that there is a non-negligible probability that Marine Le Pen wins on April 24 because her strategy to become a standard candidate has been quite successful. And Macron has high negative opinions among left and right-wing voters. However, it's yet barely debated in France. I think it's quite an interesting point here. And I was wondering why. And I think there are two elements. First, there might be a Jospin 2002 effect. Allegedly, he refused to publish and comment a confidential poll suggesting his defeat against Le Pen in 2002. He didn't want to scare the French people. So we might have this effect, is Macron or other candidates acting the same. That's the first hypothesis. I have a second one. Look, if Macron was running against Mélenchon, he wouldn't face a close race election. That's another point. So Macron would be better off running against Mélenchon. And indeed, as Cornelia said, Mélenchon is not far away anymore. So that's my last graph. This is a first round poll where you see that Mélenchon and Le Pen are now at a shorter distance than they were a few months ago. So my conclusion and the reason why we don't seem to debate a lot this non-negligible probability that Marine Le Pen will could win second round is that the left-wing opponent of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who are mostly Jadot and Roussel on the left wing, on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, they underestimate the risk of a final victory of Le Pen because it undermines voting intentions for them. If left-wing voters were convinced that Marine Le Pen can win, they would probably switch massively to Jean-Luc Mélenchon. I thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing my slides.
Thank you very much. Shahin, your take.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for having joined you a bit late. I was caught in the snow, so hopefully the snow is not going to undermine my internet connection. I don't have slides to share, and I second a lot of what has been said both by Cornelia and Anne-Laure. I think the French public opinion probably underestimates the risk of a second round between Le Pen and Macron. And I think one key question here is really to have a view on the participation rate in both the first and the second As you know, historically, the participation rate for the presidential election is very high in France, north of 70%. And so to me, the real risk of an upset in this election would stem from miscalculating or misjudging the participation rate in the first and the second round in particular. And this is where the attitude and the campaign of the candidates matter greatly. And this is where potentially the very late campaign of Emmanuel Macron, the fact that he's campaigning on a platform that is very much to the right of the platform that he campaigned on in 2017, is liable to make him a much more challenged candidate in the second round of this election. So, I think if we had had this talk a few months ago, I would have been a lot more relaxed about the second round and about a plausible victory of Macron than I am today. I am, to be fair, a lot more concerned. And the worry I have is that I don't see Macron, despite the risks, making any gestures or giving any signs that he's going to try and win over parts of the undecided left-wing electorate that will rather abstain in the second round rather than vote for him. And I think that sort of, part of the electorate that is going to abstain is the part of the electorate that Macron has to target, and has to target now, and not only in the brief moment between the first and the second round. So that's the word of caution. That being said, there might be a feeling of hubris also coming from the current geopolitical situation, which I think has greatly helped. If you look at the polls, Macron was polling slightly north of 20% before the war in Ukraine, and he has surged by at least 5 to 7 points after the Ukrainian war started. I think that has greatly helped his positioning and his standing to appear as a leader who could, negotiate with Putin, and who could be in a position to lead the country in a situation of war, is something that very few other candidates have the ability to do, and that I think has helped him tremendously. There's also been a flip side to that, which is Éric Zemmour, who was really stealing quite a bit of votes from Le Pen, has been, quite clearly undermined by his pro-Putin positions over the years. And I think he's come to pay quite a heavy toll for that in the last few weeks since the offensive. And I think that has helped a resurgence of Le Pen vote, which was not really in the cards just a few weeks ago. On the left, and I think I will have a very similar conclusion to that of Anne-Laure. On the left, what is surprising is that Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has had somewhat similar views on Russia and can be blamed for having entirely disregarded the risk of a Russian invasion of Ukraine up until very recently. In fact, he was even dismissing the very existence of mobilization of Russian troops at the Ukrainian border up until the day of the invasion. Quite surprisingly, Mélenchon has not paid a heavy toll for his views on the conflict and on Russia, and he has been, in fact, and he's still galvanizing some support on the part of left-wing voters who absolutely want to avoid a Macron-Le Pen runoff, and on voters who believe that there is a serious risk for the second round. So there is an element of strategic voting that is taking place, which I think is depleting, of course, the socialist candidate, Anne Hidalgo, and it has been the case for a while. It is depleting, to some extent, Yannick Jadot, the Green candidate. And there is I think, a growing mobilization around Mélenchon, which could help him. That being said, even if, Anne-Laure described it very well, even if he's getting closer and closer to Le Pen, even in the most optimistic polls at the moment, he's still at least 3 points behind Le Pen. So, it would take quite a leap for him to be able to go from to make up these 3 points. The real reservoir of votes for Le Pen is probably sitting in the hands of the communist candidate, Fabien Roussel, who is still polling at around 4.5%, and who, basically single-handedly is the candidate who could secure Mélenchon's place in the second round. So, keep in mind that there was no communist candidates in the previous 2 elections, and this is the first time since the last 2 presidential elections that we have a communist candidate. It seems that the 2 are quite far from a deal, and so it's very unlikely at this stage that Roussel would withdraw and call for Mélenchon. But if that was the case, that alone could basically change the nature of this election and almost guarantee Mélenchon's running in the second round. So I think I'll end with that, with the sort of similar view to those presented before, and maybe a word of caution to people who are looking at us from outside of France about a potential upset in this election, which I tend to agree has been for the time being a bit underappreciated.
Okay, thanks, Shahin. Moritz.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So much has been said, and I have this great position being coming last and now having to come up with something new. So I agree with so much that's been said, that I want to maybe zoom out a little bit and bring it back to where you started this, Thomas. I think there was a common theme in what Cornelia and Anne-Laure and Shahin said, that what looked like a relatively done deal is now a little bit more open again, and that we have questions over the participation rate. We have Marine Le Pen has been quite successful in becoming a little bit more of a acceptable candidate for many people, as Anne-Laure told us. I would still, and that would be my first point, I would still sort of from a high level, sort of 10,000 meter flying altitude perspective, stress that overall the macro constellation for Macron is pretty good. The French economy has done well in the pandemic. It has recovered quicker than the German one. Generally speaking, the economic situation is quite good, and the management of the economy has been quite exceptional, really. So that speaks for Macron. We also have, I think is the second big macro point, the sort of geopolitical constellation that plays for him in 2 ways. He's been, as far as I can see, but also I think in public opinion, a quite effective leader in this crisis, in the war. He has been quite clear on the leadership and also on France's position in this. I think this compares quite favorably also with the embarrassingly wavering position of the German government over the last few weeks. So leadership clearly has been there, and that is in constellations like this a big plus. It's also clear that France's overall, let's call it geo-economic and its energy security system has been much more vindicated by what has happened. So the country has not made the same sort of naive mistakes that the German establishment, especially the German left, has made in dealing with Russia in the past 10, 15 years. So all of this is a strong pros for Macron from sort of a macro point of view. And then the third point is, I don't know, this is probably something that an economist has to say, we can be concerned about participation rates, but they're a highly endogenous object. So the moment it looks like Le Pen could win this, the participation rate is endogenously going to go up again because there's a lot of people who are going to come in and vote because they don't want that. So it's I think it's clear that Macron has been slow to start this, and he's left a lot of the sort of the field and the stage to others, and has taken care of world affairs. But I think if what Cornelia and Anne-Laure and Shahin said is true, that things will tighten. I think there's also going to be this response by sort of the Republican camp, and participation rates then might end up. So, long story cut short, I think while things look a little bit more tight, there's still a very good bet to be on Macron's side. It's kind of his race to lose. The general macro constellation is quite favorable, and because you mentioned populism, Thomas, at the beginning, I think that's also part of that. I think a lot of the populist right and the populist left in Europe has been discredited by its proximity to Putin and Russia, and that will come up in one way or the other as well as we go into this campaign. And makes, of course, Macron and let's call it the liberal center look much better than both the left and the right.
Thank you, Moritz. Cornelia, you've been talking about this different opposition, not between the traditional left and right. When we look from the outside, it seems really striking if you put together what you may debate what is populism, what is populist, but if you put together Le Pen, Zemmour, Mélenchon in a way, you get up to whatever, more than 40% of the French electorate that is really challenging the system, and it's not in the old confrontation between left and right. First question: what do you think is behind that? What is the fundamental reason, and maybe also to the others? Then the second question would be why. I mean, it is when it's not left right anymore. It's because the traditional left has disappeared quite strikingly. So why is it? Why is only the new format on the right, if you consider that Macron's program is not really a left program?
So let me say something general about party recomposition and then go back into French politics. I think maybe even a year ago, a lot of political scientists would have said that the traditional center-left parties are dead. The third way had been unsuccessful. The leftists have tried to reinvent themselves and they've all failed, and there was no place in government for left parties. And then the German elections happened, and we now have an SPD chancellor, and the political scientists are revising their script book again. What does it take for left parties to actually make it into government? But it is a question how the left parties have fared with traditional left party politics in open economies. And that is a challenge, and not a lot of them have succeeded. And I think if I go now into France, what we can say is that the left really is struggling. The traditional left really is struggling because the center-left parties are no longer very credible. The PS, we haven't even mentioned this because the candidate, Anne Hidalgo, is so low that we don't even mention her. She was in gray in Anne-Laure's picture and has no chance of appearing anywhere. And if you add up the candidates that are still on the left, Anne-Laure was saying it would be Fabien Roussel who can help, I think it was Anne-Laure, who can help Jean-Luc Mélenchon to actually be higher than Marine Le Pen. I'm not sure that's sufficient. I think you can get just below Marine Le Pen as well by adding the two up. But Jean-Luc Mélenchon together with Yannick Jadot would beat Marine Le Pen. So the question is asked because ideologically they're closer. Why is the communist candidate still in the race and not leaving his place, so that there would be a left candidate stronger than Marine Le Pen? But we could ask it about the Greens, because the Greens traditionally are an alliance partner for the left parties, and that is another option that is up here. It's not happening. So we have a fragmentation that will lead to a second round between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. Moritz is right that if you want to bet your money, you should bet your money on Emmanuel Macron winning. But I think the alerts that Anne-Laure and Shahin have raised here are really very valid. It's a very close race. And I would say it's even, I would go in this direction of how close it is, because political scientists are only right or wrong. They don't get points for probabilistic reasoning. So either the candidates that we believe will win the elections win it, or we have to revise the basis of what we made our predictions on. And when you look at intent, this is a survey information of who is voting for a person in the first round and intends to vote for it in the second round, you do get surprising affiliations or realignment, even between candidates such as Jean-Luc Mélenchon. We will find around 20% of voters willing to vote for Marine Le Pen. So you can say from a left-right spectrum that's far away, but again, on the other axis, where it is about values that may be cultural or that may be others, maybe there is affinities that we haven't seen. It's not a one-dimensional type of comparison. We know that from Valérie Pécresse, the voters can go both ways, both towards Macron and towards Jean-Luc Mélenchon. We even know that from Fabien Roussel, the voters can go both ways, and we have some data on it. It's true that Éric Zemmour voters will probably not move in big droves to Emmanuel Macron and will go more likely to Marine Le Pen, but it's not that clean. You cannot just add up percentages. We always have these graphs that look very complicated, and I think that's what's interesting. Of course, it depends on abstentionism, but it will be close, and Marine Le Pen has become a mainstream candidate, doesn't look like just an anti-party candidate. And Thomas, the question you asked, what should we take by looking in France at all these anti-system parties? Why are there so many challenger parties or anti-system parties? It's my word rather than saying populists. It's a good question, because every country has their anti-system parties, but in the German election, the anti-system parties were the Greens and the FDP. For some reason, they were the ones that were supposed to be new and coming in with something that wasn't in the grand coalition. So anti-system is not the right word, but somehow they were promising young voters something entirely new, and that increased their vote shares. Here it is more parties that ran in France on provocation and anti-system platforms, and that's something we should look into. Why do you not get more partisan channels and more personal, identified, provocative platforms in France? To me, the question is still open.
Anne-Laure, perhaps you can help understand my question on the reasons for that. I mean, is it maybe also because Marine Le Pen, in the course of the time, she's getting a more moderate view and appearance, and then maybe very different to the AfD in Germany, there is a much more social side of the right, extreme right, which is maybe also explaining the difference that you showed in economic attitudes between the right and the extreme right. Is that catching a lot of the traditional left voters?
So on the popularity of Marine Le Pen, if you look at her economic platform, this is not true that she has a social platform. For example, recently she was talking about suppressing the IFI, so which is the last capital tax in France. As usual in these populist party, if you look more carefully to the economic platform, you would not be surprised to find platforms which are in favor to more high-income voters. So there might be an issue of perception. And her strategy to become a super standout candidate, which is close to the people, has been quite successful. That's for sure. There might be also a factor driven by Zemmour. Éric Zemmour has made her not only more acceptable. Zemmour is so extreme. He's so outrageously outrageous when he speaks that Marine Le Pen looks super fine close to him. That's the first point. And second, Zemmour is obviously the candidate for high-income voters. He has been funded by business people, very high-ranked business people, and his economic platform is super conservative on a tax system, for example. So that's the second factor that makes Le Pen more acceptable and more social, that makes her look more social, but she's definitely not. Then I would like to get back on the adjective that Moritz used speaking about Macron, because this is quite interesting. Emmanuel Macron, you call him a liberal center candidate. But I think what is important to understand in France is that he's not perceived, here again, we have a perception issue. He is not perceived as a liberal center candidate by the majority of left-wing voters. He is perceived as quite a conservative candidate regarding tax, for example. He has implemented economic policies which are in favor of high-income households. And you have lots of surveys by INSEE giving evidence on the disaggregated effect of the economic policy of Macron. So I was thinking, we have not talked about the yellow vest so far, but yellow vest is in the background. And I was thinking, instead of, I would say it's the disaggregate stupid today. It's not the aggregate situation which matters in France. Moritz, you're totally right that the economic situation is super impressive, that the management of the economic situation has been super impressive. Macro is good, but look at the disaggregate more than the aggregate situation. The inequality, even the purchasing power has increased for all households in France, but has increased more on the top than on the bottom. And that's again INSEE commenting on this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. That's again INSEE commenting on the rise of inequality, not talking about the FCO and other think tanks. So I would have a serious caveat here. As economists, we need for this, to understand this, this election, we need to get a disaggregate view and have a serious look on the inequality situation and the inequality perception in the situation. And then second and last point on the anti-system vote in France, let me give you maybe a very modest insight. There is another element we have not mentioned here is the climate change and the climate risk. There is a perception in the French population and in the world population and among the youngest generation that there is a need for a change in the economic and the political system because the current system seems not to be managing the climate risk, seems not to be suitable to implement transition to a sustainable system. So when you speak about anti-system, it's probably very prevalent among the youngest generation, and it's probably driven by this climate risk and the perception that the standard system is not managing the high risk.
Okay, thank you, Anne-Laure. Before passing to Moritz on the inequality question, which is one of your topics, Shahin, would you share, what is your answer to why is there so much of an anti-system voting? And that's fragile, and it seems like something which is quite important, irrespective of the exact outcome, and the risk is implied now in the election.
So I think there are many reasons for the anti-system vote. I think one reason that stuck with me, which I think is still very badly understood both in France and outside of France, is the level of centralization of the French system and the feeling of marginalization that it creates. And by centralization, I mean centralization on many levels, and including on the geographical level. So basically, unlike Germany, where the federal system and the economic structures create a number of a territory that has a number of very important cities with their own ecosystems and their own supply chains. The French system is very polarizing and creates a lot of small cities that feel economically deprived and marginalized. And to some extent, the Gilets jaunes movement was also a loud cry against this economic and political centralization. And that, even if, and I think this is where Anne-Laure is right about the aggregate, and I don't use that term in the same way as she does. While the economic numbers are good in aggregate, if you look at the distribution and the geographical distribution, it's still quite alarming, the impoverishment of some parts of the country. And I think that feeds a high level of resentment that I think is fuel for the anti-system vote. I wanted to go back to one theme that I don't think we've touched upon, and that I think is critical to explain the weakness of the left, and it's the question of identity politics and the very peculiar role that Islam and issues around laïcité play in the French system. I think these issues have been profoundly dividing for the whole country, but in particular for the left. And pretty much every party of the left is sort of split in the middle between a branch that is liberal when it comes to immigration, Islam, and who is sort of self-critical about the fairly traditional view of the French system around laïcité and universalism, and another part which basically is really married to this very particular French idea of universalism. And I think that is profoundly divisive on the left, and I think is one of the reasons why it's difficult to find mobilization in each of the parties that we have mentioned, because they are each internally divided around these issues. And the only party that in fact was divided on this issue and that is no longer, or at least on the open is no longer, is La France Insoumise, because Jean-Luc Mélenchon really 2 years ago made a complete U-turn and basically unified his own party around his view, which was that basically, we should be more in favor of immigration. We should have no qualms about the headscarf. It should not make this such an important societal issue. And I think that division around identity politics remain one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why the left is so broken in France and so in such a difficult position to galvanize and to forge a union.
Okay, thanks. Before passing to Moritz, I would like to, just for the last 10 minutes that we may have, bring in one question from the audience, which is simply the question from Albert Kunze, asking what is dominating the debate, but may probably be decisive in the last days before the election. And the second question, which is hugely important for us, if ever it happens what you describe as a risk and Marine Le Pen wins the second round, what does that mean for Germany and Europe?
I have an answer to the first question. I don't have one for the second. but I'll answer quickly on the important issues. I think the most important issue that we will look back at in explaining the election result is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I still think, even though it's not exactly the week ahead of time, it was the most decisive issue. But it's interesting to look at the issues that have recently come in debates. First, because Emmanuel Macron was trying to occupy certain political spaces in order to get additional voters. He threw out a new pension plan, for example, which was, or at least comments about it, which were on the territory of what the right parties would have discussed in similar terms. There is security concerns, but mainly also the case of Corsica. And I'm mentioning it because Shahin was just talking about the centralization issue. I think that's a very relevant point. Emmanuel Macron, when he is accused of being arrogant, is also always targeted as a symbol of that particular French elite that is very Parisian and very disconnected from concerns elsewhere. And the fact that the situation in Corsica is now leading Gérald Darmanin, minister, to go and just throw out there that maybe we can talk about some independent governance within Corsica, shows you that within Macron's campaign, there's a realization that would give him more votes if he says, I'm open to being less centralized. So I think that's important. And then currently the debate, I don't know if it's going to be decisive, but is about the consultancy McKinsey and the use of McKinsey in reforming the French administration. And so it's a question about how much taxpayers' money are used in consultancies. But I think it is also, again, an issue that shows you that Emmanuel Macron's government is accused of being even disconnected from its own public administration to a point where they don't ask their civil servants to come up with a vaccination plan, but they ask a consultancy, and that is a proof of too high degrees of centralization and distrust of different groups in society, including in public service. So I think that those are telling issues, but if it's going to weigh on the election, I'm not so sure. I think what's going to weigh on the election is really the war currently going on. What's going to happen if Marine Le Pen wins? I will pass the joker here to my colleagues because that's a big question.
Okay. Moritz, maybe not to answer this question, but maybe also on inequality, centralization, distribution.
I mean, I think these are good points. I think we have increasingly come around to not just look at aggregate statistics, but to look at distributional statistics. And it's clear that in France, as in other countries, the fruits of growth are not necessarily equally distributed. This being said, I would still, broadly speaking, stand by my comment that the backdrop, both on the sort of economic side and, as Cornelia also just said, on the sort of political big picture side, are in his favor, owing to the handling of the war and owing to the general state of, if you look at the unemployment rate, it is, things are not as bad as they could be. Remember, we also had a president not so long ago who really failed, and Macron's first presidency clearly hasn't failed to the same degree. So there's also going to be, a some kind of bonus for, for stability in times that are uncertain. So I learned a lot from these sort of insights into French party politics. And I think there's certainly potential for some surprises. It still strikes me that if you zoom out for a second and don't take the micro but the macro view, things overall, all these things that are happening and falling in place over the next weeks before the elections would seem to speak in Macron's favor and not against him.
I think you can even then have another perhaps meta view and say, I mean, that's for the short term, maybe an important possible explanation for the trends. But if you pass to the even higher level, then it seems astonishing for a seemingly macroeconomic good situation, stable situation, that coming back to the whatever 40% of voters voting for whatever you call it, populist, anti-system, or whatever parties, that seems quite striking and very important to better understand. I think that's something we will continue to try and understand, as we do the same for Germany and the UK and the US, where always the same question is around. Shahin or Anne-Laure, on the German and European question, I understood that Marine Le Pen is much less radical, doesn't want to leave the euro or whatever. Could you give us a picture of what that could mean if she wins the election?
Well, I have a very short answer, so I leave the floor to Shahin. Just two elements. The first one is if you compare the US to France, and if you compare then the election of Trump with the potential election of Le Pen, we would be in a much worse situation because we are a central country and our institutions are much weaker than the US. But maybe I don't have the time to argue and I will let that. But this weaker institution and the weaker civil society would be a very strong issue in France, I guess. My second point regarding Europe, I think that the European Central Bank would have a very tough job for a while to secure French debt and French sovereign risk if Marine Le Pen was to be elected. That would shaken the financial markets, I think, for a while. Much more than Trump did at that time, because she doesn't hold the same economic positions. And the ECB would have to decide whether they play in favor or against the French sovereign at that time, I think.
Okay. Shahin?
So a quick word to respond to Moritz. About the generally positive macro backdrop, completely agree, but I don't think it's ever worked necessarily in the favor of the incumbent. So if you think of Lionel Jospin in 2002, he had an excellent economic record and still was not qualified for the second round. So I would just be a bit wary about the fact that voters are electing candidates on the basis of the perceived success or failure of their economic policy. I'm not sure this is always the case. That's one point. Now on Le Pen and the consequences. So I have a slightly less pessimistic view than Anne-Laure. So I have the same worries about her, given our institutional makeup. So, you know, it's true, we are an extremely presidential, extremely centralized system where the presidential election, dictates politics very profoundly and makes checks and balances, whether by the judiciary or by the legislative branch, a lot more difficult than it would be in the US. So from an institutional standpoint, I completely second what Anne-Laure said. I'm a bit less worried on the European stage because contrary to where we were in 2017, and you have to remember that it's really in large part because of our anti-Euro and so Euro exit and EU exit that Le Pen had lost a lot of voters, and she has changed tack completely quite, after 2017. So I worry a bit less about a very profound financial shock. I think, markets understand that, the idea of leaving the euro for France is no longer advocated by anyone, not by Le Pen, not by Mélenchon, not by any candidate. So I think, Europe would be paralyzed because it's very hard to imagine seamless Franco-German cooperation in a context like this. But I think Europe would be paralyzed, but it would not be undone. So, I don't expect very severe financial stress and very high levels of speculations on French debt, depending on the economic program that, of course, Marine Le Pen would implement. But if she goes by the economic program that she has presented, there is not, a huge surge in public spending or a huge amount of public borrowing that's scheduled. So, I think it would be 5 years of loss for Europe, but I also don't believe that it would set in motion a fragmentation that could lead to the end of the euro or the end of the EU. So I think for the rest of Europe, it would be a matter of patience and hope that this 5 year of Le Pen experience would bring about a more pro-European and more liberal government after her. So I have a slightly less pessimistic view than Anne-Laure on the outcome.
We didn't talk so much about this, and maybe it's good for now not to talk about it, but maybe in the current situation, it wouldn't help let's say the Western alliance against Putin to have a French president or even election at the first moment of Marine Le Pen, probably.
No, of course, no. That the fairly united front in Europe, maybe except for Hungary, on the situation in Ukraine would clearly fracture with the election of Le Pen, and would make the situation a lot more difficult to manage in Europe. So that from a geopolitical standpoint, that would be a real blow. Okay,
thank you very much. I would like to ask you if you are, especially both French participants, if you are, let's say it's in a normative way, optimistic on at some point a left that will come back with something that could convince voters. It doesn't seem so ready to be the case.
I'll let Anne-Laure conclude. So I am not very optimistic. I think it's one thing to lose an election, and this election is pretty much lost for the left. If you think that this could be a stepping stone to something else, I don't see this election being a stepping stone to a stronger, more united, and better left force coming together in the last 5 years. But I hope that I'm just too negative on this, and that something could emerge in the next 5 years. I just don't see how it could. I think after his potential defeat, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party will be extremely divided. I think after a weak showing, the Greens will also be divided. I think the Socialist Party is pretty much in agony at the moment, which may or may not be a good thing for rebuilding the left. So it's hard for me to chart and to tell the story of a new left blooming on the ashes of this lost election.
Yeah, certainly something that we should come back to at some point after the election, which is, a striking thing. We have situations like in the US with Bidenomics, at least for some time, with some New Deal and such things and discussions, and even in Germany in the new coalition. And it seems as if there's nothing comparable in France happening, and that would be interesting for the next discussion, and very important to discuss that.
Maybe I'd just like to come in for 10 seconds. I'm as pessimistic as Shahin on the recomposition of the left, but French party politics is always very people dependent, and people can sometimes create movement and galvanize. And I think we haven't seen the people yet. It's quite impressive to consider Fabien Roussel's rise around a theme, which is a left workers' politics that has ticked boxes that other candidates haven't been able to win. So maybe there is some dynamism. I'm pessimistic about it for the reason that Shahin has just said, and I think that is really the issue to resolve for all candidates that want to create a galvanizing movement on the left, and that's the question of identity politics. We're currently in a place where this is the sleeping giant for left parties of all stripes, that the topics that they can carry, in particular the economic ones, seem to be splitting their supporters between those who think that identity politics, so this is both gender issues, inequality, socioeconomic and interracial inequality issues, what is now called wokeism in French universities has become such a strong theme that somehow the left has to defend itself that it's not trying to undo the French Republic over this. And if that issue cannot be put aside to the same degree that previously European integration was dividing some of the centrist parties and led to a split, then the left cannot get the same dynamism back that they had before. So if you cannot get the gorilla of identity politics out of the room, the left is doomed to fail getting new momentum. But I'll leave Anne-Laure the big conclusion.
Yeah, thank you. Very good point, I think. Moritz, would you just have a last remark?
No, I'll do agree with a lot of what's been said. So I think Cornelia summed it up very strongly. I'm not sure. I mean, I think should one hope for a revival of the left in its old form or not is a different question. It's a normative one, and one might have different opinions about that. But I think the analysis is very pertinent.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We will follow closely next Sunday. At least I will. I hope so. Many others. And then we will check for the second step. Will be the second round in 24th of April, and then I don't exactly know the date, but you probably know. Then there will now be the parliamentary elections, legislative elections later. I think in June, maybe. Some electoral times for France for the time being. Thank you very much, Cornelia Woll, Moritz Schularick, Shahin, Vallée, and Anne-Laure Delatte for this excellent round and deep dive in some of the main topics of this election. Hope to see you soon again and in better weather times, at least in Paris without snow. Okay, thank you.